In this lecture, we'll talk about connecting your Raspberry Pi to a network. We're going to want to do that. We want to do Internet of Things, so we need to connect to the Internet at some point. So we'll just talk about the basics of connecting a Raspberry Pi to the Internet, and it's actually fairly simple at the most basic level. So if you want to connect to a network, the first option you have is to use the wired connection. So if you look at, we're talking about Raspberry Pi B+. B+ has a wired Ethernet jack, RJ45 connector it's called. But you can see the picture right there. And it's a jack where if you want to connect with a wired connection, you can take the appropriate connector, appropriate wire, plug it in there, connect the other end into a router or a switch or something like that, and you can connect it in that way. Now, most people I expect won't be doing a wired connection. It's much more common to do Wi-Fi these days. Of course, in my office, where I have a static address, I do wired, but Wi-Fi is convenient. So if you want to do Wi-Fi, it doesn't have that built in. The Raspberry Pi B+ does not have a Wi-Fi interface built in, but you can buy one, and I'm assuming that you have one, that you've bought one of some kind. This is the one I'm using, but you can use any number of them. Basically, they're USB dongles. So if you look at the device, it's basically you plug it into USB, and it has an antenna inside, and it has a little bit of circuitry in there, and it'll communicate on Wi-Fi for you. So I'm assuming that you have one of these USB Wi-Fi adapters, and all you do is just start by plugging that in into the USB jack. Now, once you do that, you've got to configure the Wi-Fi, and this is fairly simple again. This is really very much like your standard desktop laptop running Windows or Mac OS X. It's a similar thing. You start Wi-Fi config program from the desktop, so from the top bar you can go in there and find Wi-Fi config, and it'll do the Wi-Fi setup for you. Now, you'll get a window like this, and you can also start it from the command line too if you want to, but there's a button for it too. You get a window like this, and in this window, it's straightforward. You can click on the scan button. You can see the scan button circle. You click on scan, and it'll scan the networks to find all the networks in range. And you've seen this type of thing before in other interfaces. Then once you see the list of networks, it'll pop up a list of networks that are available. You can select one of those. And then you can you can give it a password if you need a password. So depending on what kind of access you have, if you need a password, you type it into the appropriate text box. And you click OK, and it'll connect you. Now, we're assuming that this Wi-Fi network is set up for DHCP, Dynamic Host Connection Protocol. That is standard. I've mentioned this before in previous lectures, but Dynamic Host Connection Protocol, DHCP, the job of that is to give you an address, an IP address, and we'll go into more detail about this, but it gives you an IP address dynamically when you plug in. Okay? Where you could do it statically too, but to do it statically, you have to talk to your administrator and they have to set you up with an IP address. And actually, cable companies might charge you money for that and so on. DHCP, you just power on and it assigns you an address. So we assume that it's set up for that, and that is extremely common, so you probably don't even have to worry about that. If it's not set up for that, then you have to go to the router and set it up for that, assuming you have control of the router. But I'm going to assume that you have access to some network that already has DHCP configured, because we don't really want to go into router setup. So once you make that connection, then you can do things on the network. Standard things, you can, for instance, run a web browser, right, if you want to. Epiphany is the browser that's built in. So if you go to the top bar of the screen, as circled in red, way at the top, there's a little button there. You click on that button, it'll start a web browser, the Epiphany browser. And that's just the default browser that's pre-installed into Raspbian. But you can get other browsers if you want to. You can get any kind of network program, download it, and run it. Maybe some mail program or a chat program or whatever it is, and just run it. And now that you've established a connection, you can run it. Now, this type of using of the network, the way that we're talking about it right now, we're talking about it as if the Raspberry Pi is a desktop or laptop computer, right? That's how we're using it, sort of standard mode, right? Eventually, that's not what we want. Eventually, we want to use this as an IoT device. So we don't want to use it as a desktop laptop where somebody sits down and opens up a browser. We want this thing to be connecting to the internet, doing some interesting jobs behind the scenes without you having to worry about it consciously and directly. We'll talk about that later, but right now we're just talking about how to get a standard connection going. And that's the first thing you're going to have to do, however you want to communicate on the internet, is what I'm talking about, set up the Wi-Fi. Okay, so you can set up a browser. Now, one warning about setting up your network is about firewalls. Now, we're not going to talk about firewalls heavily, but you need to be aware of what a firewall does because sometimes they can get in your way. So roughly what a firewall does, so your network may have a firewall. I don't know which network you're using, but there may be a firewall built in. Like at my office, when I get a new computer, I set it up, there's a firewall the department imposes. And so I have to get them to change the settings when I get a new computer often so that I can use my machine the way I want to use it. So you may have a firewall there. Now, what a firewall does is basically the most basic firewall, it blocks traffic, okay? Blocks certain classes of traffic. What do I mean classes of traffic? Traffic coming from certain applications, okay? And we'll get into more detail about this later, but from certain addresses. So if it sees traffic coming from a particular address, it might say no, right? Because it knows that address is bad. So it can have a blacklist. Also, not just from an address, but on for a certain application. If it sees, so for instance, to use a networked application, the firewall has to be opened for that particular application. So for instance, when I set up when I get a new machine and I set it up in my office, it's always set up for web traffic, right? I can always use the web because everybody wants to use the web. Nobody sets up a firewall that actually blocks web access. But it might be set up to block by default everything else. So for instance, if I wanted to run World of Warcraft on my machine, okay? If I wanted to do that, that type of traffic might be blocked by my firewall. In fact, it probably would be blocked by my firewall. I don't play World of Warcraft. I don't play any of these games. But if I wanted to, I couldn't by default because the firewall will block all that sort of traffic. So if that happens, so what happens, actually that happens with me, some of the programs that I want to run usually is blocked when I get my machine. So I have to call the administrator and say, look, unblock this application so that I can send traffic with this application. So this may happen to you if a firewall is set up in the network that you're using, okay? So, if you run a networked application, any kind of networked application, and it doesn't work, it doesn't the application starts running, but it doesn't seem to be communicating, it might be the firewall. Now, diagnosing whether it's the firewall, there are several ways to tell if packets are being sent or not. We're not going to go into that. It's really sort of out of the scope of the class. But I just want to make you aware that if this is a home network, then you know if you set up a firewall or not. You should know if you turned on a firewall or not. And if you did, then it's up to you to fix that, to change that firewall, to open it up the way you want, right? So I'm assuming if you set up a firewall, then you know how to use a firewall well enough to be able to open it up and close it, different ports that you want to open and close it on. But if it's some sort of a network, general public networks, they're not going to block standard things, so we wouldn't have a problem. But I just wanted to mention this because sometimes it's an issue. Thank you.